G'day, my name's Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director here at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. First of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently living and where the Australia Institute office is based in Canberra. This is Ngunnawal country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. The Australia Institute is one of the country's most influential independent think tanks, and we want to welcome all of our supporters who have joined us, who normally come to our in-person events and have been joining us here in these webinars. And of course, kia ora, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, to anyone from New Zealand who's joining us from across the ditch today. Welcome to our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. During this pandemic, the Australia Institute is aiming to do these webinars at least weekly, but days and times do vary. So please check our website at tai.org.au/webinars for all the information on our upcoming guests. And just a few tips before we kick off to help make sure that this webinar runs smoothly. Please bear with us with any technical difficulties. We've done a few now, but we're still fairly novice when it comes to Zoom and webinars. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can type in questions to our panelists. You can also upvote questions from other attendees and also make comments. If you would like to ask a question of the panel directly, there's a raise your hand function that'll let us know that you're keen to ask something, and we can try and call on you in the second half of the webinar. Please make sure we keep things civil in the chat. Everyone's been pretty well behaved for the most part over the past few weeks. And lastly, this discussion is being recorded. So we'll post that recording to our website and send a link along to everyone who's attended today after this webinar is finished. So obviously Australia and New Zealand have had pretty great success in managing this pandemic, but that's not always been the case internationally, and we've seen quite a range of different responses from various international governments. And so to talk to you about the international response to the pandemic today, we are privileged to have the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, the former UNDP Administrator and patron of the Helen Clark Foundation, Helen Clark. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Allan Behm, who is the head of the International and Security Affairs Program at the Australia Institute. And I'm going to now hand over to Allan to introduce Helen properly. Thanks, Allan.
Thank you very much, Ebony. It is a truly great privilege this afternoon to introduce to our webinar series the Right Honourable Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand and the longest serving parliamentary leader of the New Zealand Labor Party. Helen began her stellar career as a lecturer at Auckland University. She was elected to the New Zealand Parliament in 1981. Helen served as Minister for Health in the Longy and Palmer governments, as Deputy Prime Minister to Prime Minister Geoffrey Palmer, and as Deputy Leader of the Labor Party from 1989 to 1993, when she became Leader of the New Zealand Labor Party. Like Australia's Julia Gillard, Helen knows a thing or two about intra-party leadership cabals, seeing off a couple of attempted challenges during her time as Leader of the Opposition. In 1999, Helen became the first New Zealand woman to have won a national election in her own right, remaining as Prime Minister until 2008. Helen's government was characteristically disciplined and measured, taking a steady-as-you-go approach to public policy. On foreign policy, her government was constructive and imaginative. New Zealand was, for instance, the first developed nation to sign a bilateral trade agreement with China. We might touch on that a bit later. Following Labor's electoral defeat in 2008, Helen moved to the backbench, typically making way for a new broom. She resigned from the Parliament in 2009 upon her appointment as the first woman to lead the UNDP, a role she filled with distinction until the completion of her second term in 2017. In this latest phase of her remarkable career, Helen heads the Helen Clark Foundation, is an internationally sought after commentator on international affairs, and is far, far too young to be a respected New Zealand political elder. But that's what she is. In an interview that went to air in March this year, Helen's advice on managing the coronavirus was leave nothing to chance. That perhaps summarises Helen's approach to government, politics and public policy generally. Helen Clark, kia ora.
Kia ora.
Helen, we might start off with a question to you there. New Zealand and Australia both moved quickly to close borders and contain the virus, notwithstanding the snafus we've had with the Ruby Princess. What are your observations about leadership and the role that that has played in the various government responses?
I think it's played a huge role. Let's face it, we have some advantages down here in the South Seas. Australia's a continent. It can police its borders, and New Zealand is two big islands a long way from anywhere. We can police our borders, but it's very easy to squander that natural advantage. Also, we weren't in the first wave of where infections were, so we had time to look at what was happening. But you can still squander that advantage, as I submit most of the large G7 economies did. So I think we were onto it at an earlier phase in the course of the pandemic than many were, and then put in place the classic public health measures. You can't hospitalize your way out of a pandemic. You have to do the basics. You have to test, you have to isolate, you have to physically distance, you need the public buy-in to it. And I think in our countries, regardless of the partisanship which goes with the democratic politics, nonetheless we have a reasonable trust in our institutions and them being upfront with us. When the word's coming from a health ministry, you better do this, you take some notice, because they're not fools and they deserve respect in our country. So yes, we led early, and I think we've got the results that absolutely vindicate the steps that have been taken in both countries.
Helen, it is really interesting, isn't it, that the leadership approach, though, between Australia and New Zealand has been quite different. I mean, you have you don't endure a federation as we do. You have a single house in your parliament. And so your Prime Minister has really been at the front and centre of New Zealand's response to the coronavirus. In Australia, we've seen something which is much more like a collective leadership. We do have a federation, and amongst our premiers, it is evident that a couple of them have taken very decisive roles, rather more like I think Jacinda Ardern has, in getting Australia into a position which is pretty similar to that of New Zealand. Would you have any sort of broad observation about leadership style here? Is it an advantage, do you think, for Jacinda to really be out on the front on her own, or do you think it might have been helpful for her to have something more of the collectivist style that we've had here in Australia, or vice versa for that matter?
I think undoubtedly it's been an advantage for us that we are a unicameral, no states, no regions with major powers kind of democracy. But I'd make the point that that can also be squandered as an advantage. If you compare New Zealand, we're a little like the boutique of Scandinavian social democracies. Now, 4 out of 5 of them have pretty much done what we've done. One, that Sweden hasn't, and the death toll there is pretty shocking actually when you look at it. So Australia's system is much more complex. It's federal. States will have different views, and you're right. Some states have clearly been much more proactive than others. But however you've done it, you've got to pretty much the same point one way or another. Your expressed strategy has been different, I think, more of a suppression management one, but nonetheless, you're aiming to crush this. New Zealand has used the term elimination, which I don't think, it's nuanced. It's actually about zero tolerance. We will get it down, as we have, to virtually no level at all. No cases again in each of the past 2 days. But as we know, that they do keep popping up. And so zero tolerance means if and when and where it pops up, you zero in on it, you suppress it, you test, isolate, contact trace, you do everything that the manual tells you. I mean, in New Zealand, there's been quite a lot of hope for the Trans-Tasman bubble because there's so many ties across the Tasman of families, and the ski season's coming up and there's trade and so on. But I think we'll both want to know that we're pretty much on top of it before that happens.
Yes.
Allan, I wonder if you might just take us through, I know the Australia Institute Security and International Affairs program recently did polling that covered a range of countries. I do apologise to participants. We were hoping to share a presentation, but the technology is not cooperating. But Allan, what were some of the key findings from that polling across, I think, 6 different countries?
Yes, we polled 6 democracies, New Zealand and Australia, obviously, the United States, the UK, Italy and South Korea. And the results overall were quite surprising. What we discovered was that globally, there had been a significant increase in trust in government by the populations of those 6 countries. But the clear outliers in this were New Zealand and Australia, which scored really, really high results in 2 aspects: trust in the government and acceptance that the governments had both done the right thing by the population. The scores were above 80% for both countries. The outlier, though, was the United States. The United States had, of all 6, the lowest level of trust in government as managing the coronavirus, and the lowest level of acceptance of government information as part of the overall population's response to the coronavirus. So without the graphs up, it's really difficult to see what the spread was, but nonetheless, New Zealand and Australia looked really, really good out of this. The test will be for both our governments to maintain that level of trust as we go through the economic reconstruction that's going to be a critical part of how we respond in the longer term to what has been a major global pandemic. Which I think, in a way, brings me to the next sort of question. And without wanting to invite you to tread onto any thin ice whatsoever, Helen, what do you think went so wrong in Europe? What went so wrong in Italy, in Spain, in France, and now what is going so wrong in Great Britain, which you might have thought would have, those 4 countries might have been up there amongst the leaders?
Well, it's been horrifying, really, to watch what's happened to our friends in Europe and in North America. And I'm one who, in the normal course of events, travels a lot. And I was in Europe from the time of Davos, where we first got briefed at a session there on what was happening in China. That was, somewhere around 23rd, 25th January, whatever. And then I was in Europe for another month after that and went back through the States and home. And I have to say, my impression from that late January to late February period was that where I was, people were kind of watching what was happening in China on the television, and never was there any suggestion it was going to come here. And I think perhaps they thought it would be like SARS or Ebola, that it was something happening to people out there, but it won't come to us. And accordingly, not enough was done to prepare. Now, down here in the South Seas, I'm not sure at what point Australia closed its border to visitors from China. We did it at the very beginning of February, and then we did it with Iran. Those were very, very important steps. The US also closed the border to China relatively early, although the virus was clearly established there by then. And President Trump has kept making the point that the WHO didn't support that. Poor WHO, it's so desperate not to offend anybody that never criticized anybody. It doesn't criticize us for closing our borders. It doesn't criticize countries that don't follow its advice and so on. But I just think that the global north, if I could put it that way, was flat-footed. They didn't see it coming like this, and they didn't act early enough.
Well, what a contrast then, Helen, with the developing world, eh? We've got Vietnam, which is the standout leader in managing it this far, with a number of the other Asian countries and African countries really performing extraordinarily well. And what do you make of that sort of very stark difference in results between the so-called first world and the so-called third world, who you might have thought would have been more flat-footed and evidently much more vulnerable given their socio-economic conditions?
There's some quite interesting opinion pieces online now, which sort of have the theme of who can learn what from whom. And the reality is that the East Asia, or shall we say Western Pacific Rim response, for the most part, has been vastly superior to what we have seen in the United States and a lot of Europe. So I think it does go back to that experience with other zoonotic disease outbreaks, having to deal with the SARS and the swine flu and being at the heart of that. Also for Africa, a lot has been learned in quite a lot of countries about disease outbreaks. Ebola, very, very sobering. And I really hope that the 3 West African countries, which were at the center of it in the 2013, 14, 15 outbreak, have kept the capacity for testing, tracing, isolation that they built then. Uganda certainly has kept that capacity. It has had brushes with Ebola, and Ebola's been on the border with it. Rwanda has really leapt into life. South Africa has actually done, really, really quite well. Look, we can't have any hubris as sort of so-called developed countries about what has happened. Our countries, Australia and New Zealand, happen to have done a bit better, but a lot of our friends have not. I think a flow-on point from that is that given that the epidemic has really exploded in the global north and the world's wealthiest countries, the spillover impacts of that for the global south are very, very great. It's a bit like the global financial crisis. Say Mozambique had no part in making it, but it certainly suffered. And so with the pandemic, which moved so quickly from being a health crisis to being an economic and social crisis, the fact that the explosive outbreaks happened in the north have exacerbated. And now you have, I checked yesterday, 102 countries, developing countries, have gone to the International Monetary Fund for emergency support. And it doesn't have the resources to deal with it all. And I've been working with former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. I know he's also in touch with Kevin Rudd, who's very active on the multilateral scene. Really, what more can we do to bring to current G20 leaders' attention the need to dig deep to stop the global economy going over a cliff with this pandemic? It was stopped from going over a cliff in 2009 with the big package, the $1 trillion package, but this is going to need to be more sizable than that.
Yes. Helen, while we're dealing in the sort of the international zone, I do want to come back to the 2 big elephants in the room, of course. But while we're talking about how the global community is responding, I wonder if you've got any thoughts about how what it means for the United Nations more broadly, what it means for the UN's agencies, and certainly what it means on the one hand for the UN itself, the UNSC, the Security Council, which has been stymied really, and that's a matter I know that you've taken to the Secretary General himself. And equally, what do you think it might mean for organisations like the WHO and your former organisation, the UNDP? What is their role and what's it going to mean for them?
Well, the failure in the international system has been at the member state level. And it's not the fault of the non-permanent members of the Security Council, nor indeed of a number of the permanent members. But the reality is that there's been a war of words and a trade war going on between 2 of the great powers for several years now. And now with the pandemic and the blame game about who started what and so on, that has spilled over into the geopolitics of the Security Council. The truth is that 6 years ago, September 2014, the Security Council took the initiative to pass a resolution declaring Ebola to be a threat to global peace and security. This is a far greater threat to global peace and security, but the Security Council cannot agree a resolution on that because some people want to put wording into the resolution that says it's the quote Wuhan virus or the China virus. Clearly that's not going to fly. I think what was even more disappointing was last Friday when another resolution which fell short of that wording also failed. And it sought to endorse Antonio Guterres's call for a global ceasefire so that everybody could focus on the pandemic, which clearly the Security Council should endorse. But of course, in the resolution also was expressing support for countries and for entities in the UN system, including, quote, specialized health agencies. And the US would not permit that wording because they said that's code for WHO and we don't like it. So there's still no resolution from the Security Council. I mean, this is really quite tragic. And meantime, the different entities in the system, and I know them all well, they're out at the country level doing what they can, but at that top level of the UN member state system, they're let down.
Yes. Well, it really does bring us to the two elephants in the room, doesn't it? I mean, how do you see that developing now? I mean, the relationship between China and the United States at this moment seems to be about as low as it can go, short of warfare. And yet nobody is able to project how it can be brought together for the benefit not only of them, but of everybody else in the world, because without those two players, how are the rest of the world going to be able to either put together the economic packages that are critically important, but even more significantly, put together the world's best practice medical responses, which the Lord only knows we all need.
And it's also election year in the United States. And as the survey that you've done shows, the American people aren't especially impressed with the way the federal administration has handled it. So, you know, find an outside threat to beat up in would be a classic campaign technique. So this isn't going to stop anytime soon. So look, recognizing that that's the reality, what can you do? I mean, my recommendation, for what it's worth, would be for diplomats to go back to the Security Council with a resolution that perhaps just focused on supporting Guterres's call for the global ceasefire, that at least would get a resolution on the books. Secondly, I think at the level of the G20, this needs to be dealt with in a very technical way. I think the finance ministers need to step up and take the lead. They need to be advising the leaders on the implications for the global economy if there's not a rescue package. I'd keep it very technical and try to, I mean, everything's political in the end, but try and keep the politics out of it. Focus on where you can find common cause.
Yes, well, Australia, as you know, made a bit of an excursion into the politics of it, calling for an independent international review of the outbreak in Wuhan, and that hasn't gone all that well. Certainly, China has brought into play on so-called technical grounds the imposition of penalties on the barley trade and the beef trade. And it's interesting that just today, the former Foreign Minister of Australia, Julie Bishop, has come out, and I think very wisely, saying, well, look, let's cool it all and let's get back into the business of diplomacy rather than getting up on soapboxes and calling the shots. Do you think that there is a role for countries like Australia and New Zealand? I mean, we're not insignificant countries. We certainly together we have a fair bit of power. Do you think there is a role for us in getting these two sparring giants to cool it and to get on with the business of ameliorating a situation which is in fact impacting negatively on everybody across the globe?
Yes, and I think Julie's words are very wise. Actually, this is not the time for anything that looks like it's a blame game. That's not constructive when you're trying to fight an epidemic. In the fullness of time, there will need to be an inquiry. What I would say with total certainty would be that the WHO itself will conduct an extensive review, maybe even ask for an external review of how it handled it. It may be that in the fullness of time, the Secretary General may want to appoint an international commission. If he doesn't, someone somewhere will appoint a credible independent commission to do it. Because in the interests of public health, we need to know what happened. We know, I understand that this bat virus it exists 1,000 miles away from Wuhan. If the wet market theory, which is the dominant theory, holds, it's probably come through illegally trafficked wildlife. So it raises all these kinds of issues. I think obviously there's been comment about the labs in Wuhan, which it is an extraordinary coincidence, but I don't see any, any significant scientific opinion that says that this is a human engineered virus. The consensus seems to be that it very much looks like one that's come from wild to human transmission. So in due course, we need the answers. But right now, I would say call it. Let's just say that's for later. What matters now is we get on top of this, that we work collaboratively to overcome this pandemic.
I'm quite aware of the time, Helen, and that there are quite a lot of questions that are coming up on the screen. So what I thought I might do is just ask you for an overview, really. Given that you're a leave nothing to chance type person, do you draw any optimism at all out of where we are at the moment? We came out of the Second World War, the global community, in one hell of a mess. And yet we were able in a year or two to put together some enduring international institutions, which up to now at least, have served the interests of mankind pretty well. Do you think that it is possible for us to sort of come out of this with a recalibration of the way in which we are going to cooperate globally for the benefit of everybody, really?
Well, I hope so, because the reality is there hasn't been a war between great powers since the UN was formed and provided that mechanism to talk things through. And one would hope in the cool light of day that diplomats reflect on what happened at the Security Council last Friday, and as I say, come back with something that could pass, that at least shows there's a basis for dialogue. The very day that the resolution failed in the Security Council last Friday was the 40th anniversary of the eradication of smallpox. And people have made the point that at the height of the Cold War, countries came together to say, we are going to eradicate smallpox. The USSR, the USA, everybody was in behind it, and it happened. We need that spirit again. And as I say, it's time, backing Julie, get back to diplomacy, try and deal with the issues to the most extent you can as technical ones, support the specialised institutions like WHO to do their job and everyone else to do theirs, G20 and finance ministers to step up. And, in the fullness of time, the pendulum will swing on the U.S. China relationship, but I suspect not in the heat of a U.S. presidential campaign.
Right. And one final question, Helen. Commentators all around the world, and I mean, you're reading them as much as I am and as much as our viewers are looking at the relative rise of authoritarianism as a form of government. I mean, we're seeing it in Europe, and the relative sort of weakening of liberal democracy. Does that hold any concerns for you, or do you think that the liberal democracies are resilient enough to bounce back and particularly collaborate, work together to uphold what is a system that ultimately benefits everybody from the point of view of their physical, their personal, and of course their economic security?
As an optimist, I see liberal democracies as having that safety valve, stabilizer written into them, which is that you can question, criticise your leaders, you can vote them in or out. New Zealand, I haven't followed the Australian situation this closely, but right through the lockdown, we've had an epidemic response committee of parliament sitting chaired by the leader of the opposition special purpose committee. Democracies kept going. The courts knocked over the Ministry of Health on the decision it made. We have our safety valve. So I think in these ways we've shown how liberal democracy can be strong. As I say, the response hasn't been so great in the UK and some other places. But again, tremendous parliamentary democracy tradition. You know, they're going to work a way through this eventually. But you're right. I mean, if you have emergencies and emergency powers are seized, that can be a charter for autocrats to suppress in a range of ways. And without wanting to be specific about the country, I saw a case where an opposition MP had set up a food distribution centre, and presumably because he was seen to be distracting attention from the efforts of the government, he ended up being arrested on quite ridiculous grounds and taken away and beaten to a pulp in a jail. I mean, this is the worst of it, but it is happening.
Yes.
Sorry, Allan, I was just going to interrupt there and say that we might go now to questions from the audience, but that was covering a wide range of topics. So thank you very much for that, Helen and Allan. And I've got a question here from Eva Cox that is quite something similar that I was going to ask of you, Helen. And she asks, can we as feminists work on upping the value of the benefits of undervalued feminized care and skills, given their strong contribution to, I guess, not only the pandemic, but also, I guess, just global development more generally. And I also was thinking about some of the commentary that's been around on the value of a more of the benefit of some of the women leaders and their response, and do they bring a different style of leadership that's helpful in a situation like this?
Yeah, so on the two parts to the question, my recollection is that women are about 70% of the total health and care workforce. And if you then isolated out the care sector as such, it would be significantly higher. And so, you know, just as the residents of the facilities have been at great risk, so have the care workers. And no care worker wants to go to work and take the disease and then see it go through the facility. So I think we do have a lot of cause for thought. In New Zealand, I think I'm right in saying that 19 of the 21 deaths have been from people in care facilities, which is very tragic. And we owe it not to the elderly and vulnerable in those facilities and the people who are supporting them to keep them as safe as possible. So that's something to build on. On the issue of women's leadership, I mean, I'm one of those who says that on average, I think the women leaders have done better than the men. Now, that's not to say there aren't great examples of male leadership. There are. I am one who thinks the president of the Republic of Korea has done a magnificent job, and there's others. But there's been a lot of attention given to Jacinda Ardern, to the Finnish, Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic prime ministers, to Angela Merkel, and so on. And people say, what is it about them? It's actually a leadership style which is often associated with women, but works very well for men as well if they adopt it. And that is to be more consultative, to listen, to engage, to empathize, and not be so top down, but bring everyone along with you. And be prepared to take advice. Don't think you know it all. And I think these women leaders have very much shown those characteristics, and the men who've done well have also exhibited them.
I'm going to go now to one of the questions from the Q&A, but Barbara Kirkman, if you're on the line, we're going to come to you next for your question. This question is from Craig Ling, who asks, what do you think about the Trans-Tasman relationship in terms of opening up our economies in the coming months? I'll go first to you, Helen, and then to you, Allan.
Well, as I said, there's a lot of excitement in New Zealand about the possibility of the Trans-Tasman bubble. I think your Prime Minister has said he wouldn't revisit that any time before July, and I think that's wise. You're still working through a number of, sort of spates of outbreaks. The Melbourne one has certainly come to my attention. So, look, fantastic if it could happen. But I think both sides will want to be sure that we've got it under control and we have a capacity to swarm in on cases wherever they appear. For my part, I'd like to see the South Pacific benefit too. I mean, their tourism is disproportionately from New Zealand and Australia, and so important to their economies. So if there's any chance of bringing the South Pacific COVID-free countries into the bubble, I think that would be fantastic.
And Allan, your response?
Yes, Ebony, I think that the relationship, the economic and political relationship between New Zealand and Australia is, of course, immensely close. And it's part of my career. I had the privilege of working very, very closely with New Zealanders quite through the 80s and the 90s. And we are at one on all of the things that matter, and indeed on quite a lot of the things that don't matter. We have a high degree of interconnection between our communities. So it doesn't surprise me at all, for instance, that Australia and New Zealand sort of paralleled each other in the responses to the questions we put out in our survey, for instance. There are very deep resonances between our societies, and I think that should give all of us a huge amount of confidence that as we come through this pandemic, at least Australia and New Zealand will get back into business pretty quickly, I think. Gosh, the Warriors are here already, Helen.
That's right. I wish I could predict victory.
They're in isolation in Tamworth, Helen.
Yeah, well, they'll probably be in quarantine when they come back here if they ever do as well.
Barbara Kirkman, if you are there and can unmute yourself, do you have a question? Oh, can't seem to unmute Barbara. Paige Margaret, or Margaret Page, I'm not sure which way around that goes. We might come to you next. But the next question I've got from Karen Demeja. She asks, Helen, you led the UNDP for a long period. How do you think the work of aid organisations has been impacted, and what role are they going to be playing in the recovery?
Well, firstly, a pandemic requiring an emergency response will, divert resources from mainstream development. But hey, everything has to be repurposed at the moment to fight the pandemic as the top priority. My experience at UNDP with the Ebola outbreak was that in the 3 countries that were at the epicenter of it, and we're not talking 3 countries now, we're talking everyone, you just drop what you were doing and you leveraged off every project you had to turn it into a fighting the epidemic activity. So you can bet that, let's take UNICEF, for example, UNICEF Zambia, whatever it was doing, there'll be a huge focus now on how do we, put a lot of attention onto the pandemic, and also seeing that basic services continue. There's obviously concern that in the middle of a crisis, maybe children won't get their vaccinations. Maybe the care for the woman expecting a baby won't be there. What about sexual and reproductive health services in general, family planning? So I think you'll find a lot of the agencies that are active in this space will be also working to keep the essential services going for people.
Paige Margaret, are you there? I'm not having much success unmuting our people who are raising their hands here. I'm terribly sorry. I'll go back to, I'm not sure why that's not working to unmute you all. I'm terribly sorry, everyone who's raised your hands. I'm not quite sure what the issue is there. I've got another question here from Gregory Thompson, who asks, in your role as chair of the EITI, what role does it have in countries, or what role do EITI implementing countries play in the response to COVID-19? And what can Australia take from EITI global experience in this pandemic?
Firstly, we'd love Australia to be an implementing country of EITI. EITI has a standard, like a convention. Australia's a supporting country and very supportive, but if it implemented the standard, that would be great.
And I might just say it stands for extractive industry. I should know this.
Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative.
Thank
and
you.
The philosophy is that countries should benefit from their natural endowment. And in, of course, many countries, and Blood Diamond Sierra Leone is the most gross example, I guess. There's been wars, conflict, in many countries, revenue loss, corruption, etc. So it's about, seeing that the money actually flows to where it should. So yes, I mean, our implementing countries have been very much impacted. Interestingly, we had a discussion at the EITI a couple of months ago around energy transition, because we are sending a signal to the countries that have built up a reliance on oil and gas revenues that they need to be thinking about when this isn't going to be wanted. And there was a bit of resistance, I must say, in some quarters to that conversation. But in a sense, this is like a sharp shock to demand for product, like the energy transition will, in the end, produce. And it's pretty tough on budgets. Take Ghana, which was a fairly late mover, and has come onto the scene at a time when prices haven't been so great anyway. Others who are looking to exploit. So I think it's going to need a fundamental rethink about economic strategies in a lot of countries, and that's what we were urging from EITI leadership with respect to the energy transition anyway.
Allan, you're a former Chief of Staff to Greg Combay. Did you have anything you wanted to add there?
No, not on that point, I think, Ebony. I'm following the questions, of course, that are coming in on the board here, and there are some very interesting questions around international education, particularly Chinese students coming into Australia and so on. Now, I suspect that there might be some of the viewers who'd like some commentary on that, if that were possible, particularly given the dependency of our tertiary institutions in both New Zealand and Australia on foreign students. They're in a terrible hole right at the moment, with seemingly little prospect of getting out of it until we have the students coming back in again. So what options do we think we've got in front of us to normalise the experience of those people who are actually paying for our services, and at the same time on whose sort of cash flows we are at the tertiary sector very dependent?
Well, I mean, my opinion is, and it seems so ridiculously simple, I'm not quite sure why it's not being followed here, but with the second year semesters due to start in the middle of the year, couldn't Australia and New Zealand be signalling now that they will receive foreign students, but they have to spend the 2 weeks in quarantine when they arrive? I mean, I know what a great dependence and many of the institutions here, and of course in Australia, there is on foreign student money. So surely exceptions can be made for valid student visas, providing they meet the quarantine requirements. It seems a no-brainer to me.
Can I say, Ebony, I strongly agree with what Helen has just said there. And we have in Australia, Helen, another problem which has actually created a fair bit of pushback, and that is that our foreign students are not able to access either of the two big funding programs. And so we have the terribly unfortunate sight of foreign students queuing outside restaurants for free meals. It hardly reflects well on the kind of investment that we should be making in those students to keep their investment in us. The mutuality part of it just seems to be awful, and certainly the Australian opposition and the Greens have been putting a fair bit of pressure on to the Morrison government to widen the applicability of these two big programs for foreign students. And I think that is another aspect of this problem that we really should be tackling head on.
And as a loyal New Zealander, that leads me to make another point that of course there's some 600,000 New Zealanders in Australia, and for the response to the pandemic, whatever your equivalent of the unemployment payment or wage subsidy or whatever is, those who've been in waged employment for the past year have been able to access it, even if they haven't come on the full, green card system for Australia. As you know, people can come across just from New Zealand and work, but they don't enjoy normally social security benefits. But for those who've been in jobs for a year, they do. However, we're seeing quite a lot of stories on our television now of the people who've been in Australia for years, but are in between jobs, they're on contract work, and they don't qualify. And what I would say to Australia is that you run the risk of a whole lot of people coming back to New Zealand. And when your economy picks up again, those workers won't be there for you, and you will miss them. So I think there needs to be a little bit longer term thinking here. New Zealand governments, will be advocating very hard on this, but just, worth making that point that you've got quite a significant Kiwi workforce that doesn't feel it's covered by the measures at the moment.
Yeah, and it is an equity issue.
Eva Cox, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Thank you so much. What's your question?
I wanted to follow up on the question I had earlier, Helen, which is basically the idea that we should actually be, that we should need to think about where we go from here. And what's worrying me at the moment, certainly in Australia, and I don't know how far it is internationally, you seem to have escaped it because you've got a well-being approach to budget, is the government is pushing just to put us back and hand over to business and let them create more jobs, ignoring the fact that we were short of jobs even before this particular thing happened and didn't have enough, even though we imported people, and that's another issue. But how do we actually get to the point where we actually validate both, and that's I suppose why I was asking the women's stuff, both the sort of unpaid stuff, the arts, the various other things that make a good society, and not focus just on a sort of neoliberal version of the future, which is make more money, make more money, make more money, and rip everybody else off in the process, because that's what it's all about. Because coming out of this particular situation, which has created quite warm social groups within a lot of the society, which could be built on, and B, is going to sort of create much greater inequities than we even had before. I think we need a social approach, and I'd just be curious to see how you think we could achieve that.
I think that this crisis provides a turning point, and we could just say, oh, well, we're through it and we'll go back and try and do things the way they were. But I think that would miss the opportunity for a transformative approach, which would look at how we could make our societies more inclusive, more resilient, and more sustainable. And I don't know about your cities, but I live in the middle of Auckland. I've never heard so many birds and insects in my life as I did during the lockdown when the traffic noise went. People in Kathmandu have seen the mountains for the first time in years. Actually there was an environmental upside to this, tragic downside of the pandemic. So there's a lot of voices saying we don't just want it to go back the way it was, because it wasn't that great, either on the equality front or on the environmental sustainability front. Maybe it's time for a fresh approach, and that's certainly my thinking.
Asha Sriram, I wonder if you're on the line.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Helen. So I'm I'm an international student, so this is also extremely personal to me because I'm stuck here. Anyway, so the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of exposed a lot of the flaws with our liberal order. And the burden of the socio-economic and political recovery has to be borne by like my generation or the next generations to come. So during this flashpoint in history, do you think that, the world leaders who are going to be leading the world have to address the deep structural issues within our liberal order and unlearn and unmake a lot of our institutions? And if yes, does this mean that the global north is finally ready to go back on its development a little bit to help increase equality among nations?
It hasn't shown that degree of solidarity to date, we have to say, notwithstanding that there are a number of generous countries who reached their 0.7% of gross national income going to development. But of course, the development assistance expenditure is the petty cash of the overall funding for development. And what developing countries want is the capacity to be able to grow their economies sustainably. And I think, in this age of the Paris Agreement and dealing with the climate change issues, the growth needs to be green and sustainable. It needs technology transfer and so on. So, wise heads at the global level should be looking to take the SDGs off the shelf, the Sustainable Development Goals off the shelf with that being through the pandemic, and say we did have some answers in here, but and we need to get serious about them, because otherwise we just will go in a downward spiral from here. You're right. I mean, the debt burden is going to be very large and borne by future generations. And having an austerity approach isn't going to help. We have to try and grow our way out of this in a sensible way, and not further crush communities that have already been crushed by the crisis.
Allan, did you have anything you wanted to contribute to that?
I'd really strongly support what Helen said just then. What we've actually seen in the advanced economies that have signed up to the neoliberal order is, in fact, the positioning of profits before people, and more particularly, austerity imposed through the removal of safety nets. And I suspect that one of the problems we're seeing in Europe is that with those safety nets removed, vulnerable people, but particularly people in the gig workforce and so on, actually have no protections whatsoever. And yet their generation, because many of them are young, are going to carry an enormous debt burden. So the big test for national leaders now is to be able to reopen the economy on quite different rules, where governments actually play a role in generating prosperity, rather than falling back on that tired old saw that it's for the market to do all that, and for governments simply to regulate it.
Mm-hmm.
I might try now to go to Adrian White. Adrian, are you there? Hang on, I can see that you are not unmuted. So we'll come back to you, Adrian. I can see another question here from Wayne McMillan. And he asks, is multilateralism really back on the international diplomacy table to deal with pandemics and climate change? First to you, Helen.
Well, it should be, but what's happened with the WHO coming into the firing line hasn't been that helpful, and the Security Council not doing its job hasn't been helpful. And the international financial institutions not being funded to do what they need to do hasn't been that helpful either. But what I think we should press for as this first wave of the epidemic has crested and come off a little bit is for countries to once again look outwards and not just inwards, and say we're only going to solve this together, and look for ways of having initiatives which will help us work cooperatively. I must say an honourable exception to all of this has been the European Union, which hosted the pledging conference for funding for vaccine therapeutics and diagnostic development relevant to COVID-19, and just in the last couple of weeks, and that raised close to the $8 billion, which was wanted, and was actually well defined by the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board set up by WHO and the World Bank following the Ebola epidemic. So that mechanism at least has worked. But yeah, time to look outward now and to emphasize that we're in this together. And as the old saying goes, you can hang separately or you can hang together.
Allan, did you have anything you wanted to say to that?
Simply that multilateralism has been under pressure for the last 2 decades, really, and with major countries, but particularly the United States, wanting to go it alone on so many different things without any recourse to multilateral mechanisms. I think the only way for the world to move forward is through a reinvestment in the critical multilateral institutions, but also for countries such as Australia and New Zealand to get right back into the business of building coalitions around the things that matter. I mean, there are plenty of countries who are pursuing the same kinds of interests for their peoples as New Zealand and Australia are, but I think we do have to really reinvest significantly in that kind of global multilateral diplomacy.
Thank you. I can see that we've got attendees from New Zealand and all across Australia. There's currently more than 1,100 of you. I do apologise. I think we hadn't turned on the ability to upvote and comment in the Q&A, so hopefully that's been fixed and you can see a range of questions there. I'm sorry, we've had a couple of technical snafus here, but we do have a number of questions I can see that relate to climate change. And here in Australia, obviously, we've seen a really different role paid in attention to science and expert advice that we really just haven't seen at all in our approach to climate change policy. But Helen, can you talk, I guess, in general about the implications of how we've approached this pandemic, and being science-led might have implications for the Paris Agreement and how we approach tackling climate change in future?
Well, one would hope that it might be a good precedent. Look, you know, I mean, I'm proud to say that New Zealand government does get it on climate change. Of course, we have a complex coalition here, but it's managed to get through Parliament with unanimous agreement, except for one vote. It's zero carbon legislation, and that's important because, you know, in the past, you know, I went hot on climate change. Next government went cool on it. This one's going hot on it. But you need long-term, bipartisan, multi-partisan buy-in to the national strategy to really get an impact. And I sense in Australia, opinions still pretty polarised because of the strength of some of your major corporate sectors. But you know, it's interesting how with the pandemic, all of a sudden we kind of forget about the bushfires. But what a terrifying spectacle that was. I just still, you know, devastated really seeing it, what happened to people, their communities, to wildlife. And, you know, you had the climate change debate raise its head there. Look, this had been a very, very hot season. You've been through a lot of drought. Okay, Australia's always had bushfires, but the conditions were, you know, pretty unprecedented even for Australia. So I just hope that there will be more regard given at the top levels to what the science is saying, and to looking at what Australia can do to, you know, survive what's happening and hopefully contribute to reducing that stock of greenhouse gas emissions and carbon that's up there.
We've only got a couple of minutes to go here, but I'm going to try and sneak in one last question, but I'll go to you first, Helen, and then to you, Allan. Marianne Cosgrove asks, is it time to forget about trying to engage with the United States and for the rest of the world to be acting multilaterally without them?
We can't forget about the United States. It's a large country, it's a large economy, you know, it's been a pillar of the international system. It happens to have a president at the moment who's one out of the box. But, you know, when you look at the US as a great democracy, in recent years, we've seen it swing from a Bill Clinton to a George W. to a Barack Obama to a Trump. It's going to swing again. And, you know, there's a chance that the America, as we've more or less known it, will be back. But it's, you know, I can say, because I'm no longer in diplomacy or New Zealand public life, we're living through a reasonably bleak period at the moment.
Allan?
Oh, look, the United States will long remain a principal player in global affairs. So whether we like it or not, we absolutely have to deal with the United States. But more than that, I think for Australia, we might look a little bit to New Zealand's experience in managing its relationship with the United States. It was able, when Prime Minister Longy was in government, to separate itself from the United States in a really, it was dramatic at the time. I had to deal with it, and yet New Zealand has managed to maintain and build, actually, a very mature relationship with the United States. So I think for Australia, we've got to stop thinking of the United States as our security blanket and having an attitude of dependence on the United States. What we should be looking at in our relationship with the United States is the reality of an enormous democracy with a constitutionality which is quite similar to ours, and a country with which, over the foreseeable future, we will inevitably build and continue to enjoy a really, really strong relationship. So it's not an either or a turning off. It's a question of changing the nature of the relationship a bit and looking for a plurality of links with the United States rather than simply talking all the time about a defence treaty.
Thank you, Allan. And I might just finish up. We've got a comment here from Sakai Holland, and I think it might be the Sakai Holland, the Zimbabwean Co-Minister of State for National Healing and Reconciliation. And I'll just wrap up by talking about her comment. Helen, she said that you'd answered her question on the broad response to what our future approaches could be, but she wanted to underscore how the new beginning for civil society networks in Zimbabwe for community-based strategies for an inclusive society, accepting our diversity and adopting guiding principles for how they work together in future has been very successful, but the bigger task is for serious transformation of our political structures and the processes which have been very slow to change, making progress slow as well. So perhaps we might wrap it up there. Thank you very much for that contribution, Sakai Holland. And thank you, Allan, and to you, of course, Helen Clark. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much.
We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We really appreciate you coming along to this webinar series. As I said, we've had more than 1,100 people participate today, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions. If you are in a position to help chip in a few dollars to cover the costs of putting on these webinars, which aren't free, we would appreciate that. You can contribute at tai.org.au, and please join us for our next week's webinars, which are on the Australian government response to COVID-19 with Health Minister Greg Hunt in conversation with our Chief Economist Richard Dennis. That's next Tuesday at 11 a.m. for 45 minutes. And the following day, Wednesday the 20th of May, we have Zali Stegel, the independent member for Warringah. She's going to be talking to our Head of Climate and Energy Program, Richie Merzian, about the role of climate action in the recovery. You can find and register for those webinars at tai.org.au/webinars. And please make sure you're subscribed to our podcast, Follow the Money. You can follow that on iTunes or where you normally listen to podcasts. And please stay at home if you can, keep safe and keep washing those hands. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much, everyone.